Eli tässä on nyt siirrytään niin Ranskan vallankumouksesta suomalaiseen vallankumoukseen. Ja kyllä tämä teknologia mahdollistaa sen, että siis digitaalisuus mahdollistaa sen, että meillä on oikeasti olla veljeys ja vapaus. Ja nyt speksataan sitä. Ja nyt jotta me ymmärretään sitä paremmin, niin on hyvä kuunnella esitys, jossa on tällainen Mydata-operaattori, joka oikeasti yrittää sitä hyvän kierrettä saada aikaiseksi. Että miten saadaan luottamusta eri toimijoiden välillä. Ja hänen mielestään ei Mydataa voi ymmärtää, ellei ymmärrä Mydex-bisnestä. Hän on sosiaalinen yrittäjä ja tämä Mydex on sosiaalinen yritys. Ja näillä sanoilla mä briefasin, että mä saan introta Williamin you trust me, I introduced you already in Finnish. William, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you can all hear me okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's very nice to be back in Helsinki for my third visit. We have a lot of respect for the work of the Open Knowledge Foundation in the UK, and it's really good to see a healthy chapter of the Open Knowledge Foundation starting up in Finland in the 2 years since the OK Fest was here. It's really good to see this level of business interest in Mydata in Finland. And I'm also really pleased to see that the Finnish government is engaging with civil society in the early stages of thinking about Mydata. So my aim in coming over here is to help start a discussion about Mydata in Finland. But we have to start with what do we mean by Mydata? And Yogi and I had an intense discussion about this last night in the Garlic restaurant. It could mean the personal data about individuals which is held by organizations such as businesses and government, including information in their CRM systems, transaction data, smartphone data and the applications. So that could be a meaning of Mydata, which is I think what Yogi shared with you in the introduction. I'm more used to using Mydata to describe a policy or a program designed to bring transparency and access first, and then eventually to transfer control over that data to the individual so that it becomes my data. And in this sense, Mydata as a program or policy is one fundamental dimension of a much wider change to a personal data ecosystem which is based on participation and consent by the individual. There may then be greater reuse and sharing, but it's always then based on the permission and the control of the individual. So I will use the words personal data to describe the data, and when I speak of Mydata, I mean the idea of a policy or a program with the participation of business and of government and of civil society, which is designed to bring around that change. Now, a Mydata program can be, but doesn't have to be, government-driven or government-sponsored. What it does require is government participation and support. So, for example, in the US, the program which they called Smart Disclosure, before they changed the name to Mydata, was sponsored by the White House with one of the presidential fellows. It resulted in the blue button, where an army veteran can press the blue button and download their medical record. There's a yellow button where you can download your state education data. There's a green button where you can download your energy data. And the political aim of this is to have better informed citizens. In France, they have a program called Mes Infos, which means my information, my data. And this arose independently from an industry think tank called FING, the Fondation de l'Internet Nouvelle Génération, run by a very clever guy called Daniel Kaplan. It seems to me, when I went to the conference at which Mes Infos was launched, that their main motivation was that they were worried the British were getting an advantage, and this was very invigorating for the French businesses. But they've made a lot of progress. I think France is the first country where I've seen mobile phone companies giving the location data back to the individual subscriber so that you can build new apps which are privacy friendly based on the mobile phone location data. In Britain, a few years after we started Mydex, there was a UK political programme that started in the business department, and it was about consumer empowerment. And they said, we think open data has been a success. We would like to give structured data back to consumers so that they're more empowered. And they said to companies like utilities and banks and retailers, they said, we'd like to encourage you to do this, don't make us legislate. And eventually they did legislate, so now the Minister, the Secretary of State, has the power at the stroke of a pen to compel regulated sectors of industry to hand over data in a structured format to individuals. There was a slight irony that the business department was legislating to force businesses to hand structured data over to individuals at the same time that the Ministry of Justice, which does the data protection liaison in Brussels, was lobbying against the provision because of the business lobbying that Niels referred to in his talk. But these government is a multi-headed hydra, and each head has a different brain, and they all think different things at the same time. So I think it's very important for those present from government or those who work with government to understand that the role of government is not simply as a theoretical policy maker or an imposer of legislation. Government is a principal actor in Mydata, based on people's interactions with government, particularly their emerging digital interactions. Government needs ID assurance. Government has transport data, health data, education, justice, employment. So each operational part of government needs to ask itself, what data do I have that I could usefully give back to citizens, to individuals? Proof of car ownership, proof of verified address, proof of employment history, of employment status or of disability. And it's not just not just transactional data, but proofs of claims that people might find useful in different interactions. That's part of the question for government, and the other part is, what digital proofs will government accept from the individual, so proofs that are held by the individual, that mean that they're entitled to get a public service. So fundamentally, a Mydata program is wholly dependent on the active participation of business, of phone companies and banks, and utilities, retailers, app developers, and online businesses. But I would argue, and I will try and set out, that this is fundamentally a matter of enlightened self-interest. It may feel like giving something away, and it may feel counterintuitive if people are possessive about data, but fundamentally this is vital for the relationship of trust with your customers. It's about treating your customers as adults and working with them in a permissioned, shared, contractually robust manner to ensure that with their consent you have the rich data set necessary to support the relationship that you really want, as opposed to treating your customers as if they were ciphers or children and jealously guarding or hanging on to the holdings of customer data which you have, however wrong and incomplete they may be. I think that Mydata provides a huge opportunity for innovative new services, and I think it also averts a major competitive threat. So I think that Mydata is every bit as important as open data, on which Finland and other countries have made really good progress. I think it's considerably more important for reasons that I'll explain. Now, my name's William Heath, as we heard from the introduction. I'm a social entrepreneur. I'm chairman of a social enterprise called Mydex KIC, which means Mydex Community Interest Company. I sat for 2.5 years on the UK Mydata Strategy Board and have participated in the French Mydata program just at workshops. Mydex KIC is one of the UK government's identity assurance providers. So people can use their Mydex service to go to government for new digital services to prove that they're entitled to these services. Now, my contention is that you cannot make sense of a program like Mydata unless you have some additional infrastructure, unless you have something like Mydata, of which there are several initiatives. So what I'm going to do now is I will explain what Mydata does, and I'll explain the problem it was designed to solve, and how we've done it. So, if this works. The contention is, shall I take the microphone? Our contention is that, is this working? Can you hear me at the back? Personal control over personal data is good for everyone. Now, why does it matter? Globally, with the internet and with e-commerce, we have a situation where you have new social networks, search engines, and smartphone apps, and all of these are provided on a false premise. Because, Niels, I know we were meant to read the terms and conditions, but no one did. And no one can. They're not designed to be read. So effectively, we have a whole new industry sector built on a false premise of a false relationship. Because as people say, if you're not paying for it, then you're the product. It's your personal data that's being exploited in a way which people can't really understand or appreciate, even if they're quite sophisticated. This stifles innovation. I mean, how many of us look at a smartphone service and think, oh, that looks interesting. Maybe I better not. I don't know. Can I be bothered to read? No, forget it. That problem is huge in terms of the online services to help people manage their health and their finance, their travel, their shopping, which simply cannot emerge because there's a loss of trust. And for organizations, this means that there are new digital services they could provide if people did trust them, but they're blocked and they can't come out. They sit on huge holdings, fast-growing holdings of customer data, but the quality is very bad. And they don't know how bad it is, how much replication there is, how much is out of date. There's a growing regulatory cost because, bless them, Niels and people like him, they put out European data protection regulation to try to protect us, which is practically impossible to do, legislation versus technology. But it's essential to try and to establish the principle of personal consent. And for companies, it just looks like risk. You know, how many companies here have actually deleted all the data they no longer need? How many companies here are completely confident that the data they hold is accurate? No one, anyway. It's a problem for individuals because we lose the convenience and the control that we would have over our affairs if we still control our personal data. It's time wasting to have to re-enter data every time, not to reuse the data from one insurance application in another situation, to have to transfer your account from one place to another place. It's wasteful and problematic. Now, we're trying to convey here the idea that the organizations the individual deal with, they all talk to each other about the individual, but the individual isn't actively involved in that process. The bank or the government agency checks with the credit agency, the phone company checks up on you with somebody else. You're not involved. It's very inefficient and problematic. Now, the notion of personal control of personal data is globally accepted. So it's one of the trends The Economist said for 2014. In the UK, Nesta is our endowment for innovation. They said one of the essential trends for the coming year is personal control over personal data and what it makes possible. The World Economic Forum has been going on like this for several years. The value of personal data when it's personally controlled. In Britain, we have three main parties, the Liberal Democrat, Conservative, Labour. They all have personal control over personal data in their manifestos. At a political level, it's obviously appealing. Everyone agrees. They don't know how to implement it. They don't know what it means, but they all agree that it's somehow fundamentally right. So, what Mydata offers is a personal data store for the individual, a place in the cloud where the individual can acquire their data in a structured form. It's encrypted only by the individual, only the individual has the key, and then through a very standard API and the standard tools that are commonly used, the individual can permit the sharing of that data, bilateral encrypted sharing with an organization. And for the organization, they can put in a single API, they can connect to individuals at a very low cost. When I say a very low cost, if it's an organization that sends out letters ever, for the price of sending one letter, it could connect to the individual for 10 years with as much data flowing in both directions without limit. So it's a personal data store which comes with a Mydata identity which supports OpenID or Mozilla Persona or other protocol identities, and an encrypted connection which the individual initiates to an organization. If the individual is unhappy about the connection, the individual can stop it. It's on standard terms. It's all wrapped in a legal and technical trust framework where it's one set of terms and conditions. If I'm going to share my data, here are the rules, and everyone does it according to those rules. You don't have to read every single provider's 80 or 90 pages of terms and conditions. You just have the one short set. So that's what Mydata offers. We believe that Mydata and online trust form a virtuous circle. We all want digital services. Everybody's saying digital is the future. There's a sort of imperative to go digital. I think the thing about digital is it's only valuable if you do it right. There's a deep flaw in how we've done digital services to date, which is they are wholly organization-centric. It's like living in the age of Galileo and saying science is a good idea, and we can all agree about that. But if we're doing science based on the idea that the world is the center of the universe, we've got bad science, and if we shift our perception and say, well, it revolves around the sun, we can have good science. Well, similarly, with digital, if the digital architecture is wholly based around the organization, there are limitations and problems which are very, very serious and very evident to all of us. And if you introduce the simple idea of a digital architecture with the individual at the heart, this solves immensely expensive and dangerous problems. So, we all want digital services. Mydata is about data exchange. The idea is that you transfer a record from the organization to the individual, and the individual can transfer it back, perhaps corrected or changed or amended in some sort of way. So, when you have data exchange in a structured, permissioned, encrypted way between individuals and organizations, what the individual acquires is not just transaction data or location data, it can be real proof of claims. So, for example, verified address from the fact that you have a bank account, or the fact that you're entitled to drive, or that you're the owner of a car. It's not simply usage data or clickstream. You can acquire digital certificates that prove the claims that you make. Now, these proof of claims are what make up, in the UK government vision of the world, ID assurance. Because if you want to prove who you are online, or prove you're entitled to something, you want to produce digital certificates to do it. And it's that sort of ID assurance that is going to make digital services far more convenient. In Britain, I don't know about Finland, but the government is broke, we've run out of money. We have to have digital services by default, coming from quite a long way behind the position in Finland. This means channel shift is really urgent, and to do that you have to have ID assurance, which currently in the UK we do not have. So the virtuous circle is about data givebacks and the reuse of proof of claims. And in Mydata's view, you just start with an email address, that's enough. You pick your own encryption key, which the individual has, and the individual controls, and no one else has. So you're not giving access to all your data to an organization. Mydata can't see any data. You then have a multi-protocol Mydata ID, which would support Shibboleth, or OpenID, or Mozilla Persona, or whatever protocol you need to log in. And then as you make the connections to the organizations you deal with, this adds trust in a virtuous circle. So that's the process as we see it. Now, as somebody said at lunch, this is all about trust, isn't it? And the question is, how can you introduce a dimension of trust into a huge online economy which is going at an incredible speed and which people have huge amounts invested? Well, there may be many answers to this, but this is our answer. We felt, in governance terms, a different legal form was important. So we want to be an enterprise, a social enterprise, but locked to a community purpose. So we have a British legal form which says we can make a profit, but the majority of our profit, 2/3, has to go back to our community purpose. We can create a valuable company, but we cannot sell it to a company that is not asset locked. We cannot sell it to a classic Silicon Valley entrepreneur company, which means conventional venture capitalists aren't interested. And by law, we have to serve the interests of our members, people who use digital data, as well as making a profit. It's not simply about making a profit. You need a commercial business model which keeps people's data safe. Wherever you have this tension between shareholder value and trying to be a good steward of people's data, shareholder value always wins. If there's a tension between security and being a good steward of people's data, security always wins. So you have to have a strong legal and commercial protection for people's data. It's free to individuals. If organizations connect, they make a micropayment. They see vast savings from this, and there are opportunities for new revenues. In legal terms, we set out the core terms and conditions in an overall charter. When you make a connection, there's a specific data sharing agreement, and this means in data protection law terms, the individual becomes the data controller. So the data subject is also the data controller and can also be the data processor. As Niels rightly said, the present data protection law was conceived before the internet. They never conceived of the individual, the data subject, as being the data controller as well. But if you do that, it solves the problem that Niels kept speaking about, which is informed consent. Because the individual can issue an informed consent to data sharing. So if you want a wider service from your bank, based on a wider set of data, you can press a button and say, that's okay. Or if you have a long-term health condition and you need social housing and hospital and ambulance and GP and therapy, you can press a button and say, it's okay to share what's necessary to give me a joined up service. In technical terms, we're a UK-based cloud service. It's the internet. You can use it from here. You're very welcome. Open source software seems essential to us. Standard encryption and software as far as possible. And the support of multiple protocols. So in the UK, we take the view that this approach is good for everyone. For individuals, it can give convenience and restore control and agency to your life. It's going to save time, because you've got your data in a structured form, which you can share when you want to do it with other organizations. The beneficial value of your personal data when you control it is much more valuable than if it's data that's inferred about you by other organizations who don't really know you. Because you can mix it with golden data that's only in your head. Your intention to buy a car, to take out life insurance, to move house, that's gold dust. Companies will invest millions to try and get that. If they asked you nicely, you could give it to them. So that value is restored to the individual. For organizations, it means savings through better data quality and more efficient transactions. It supports a better and more trusted relationship. And the competitive threat, which I think faces banks and utilities, all these businesses are looking at Google and Amazon and saying, well, hang on a minute, what happens if they come after the banks? You know, Facebook's just introduced telephony. The only response, you can't out Amazon, you can't out Google. What you can do is take a deep breath and say, do you know what? Those companies put themselves at the center of the world, and what we could do is put our customers at the center. So if our customers could manage their relationships with their utility and their bank, their insurance and travel and shopping, and if all of those services were on a basis where we said, we're trusting you, the individual, to look after your data, then you can outmaneuver the Web 2.0 businesses with all their susceptibility to what Snowden revealed of NSA surveillance, all the monetization of personal data. There is an outflanking maneuver which an entrepreneurial, enlightened society could start to do. I'm looking at you, Finland. There we are. So for the world, it could run on a much more efficient digital logistics if you introduce this element of trust. And that is, I think, where valid economic growth is to be found. Now, I just want to quickly position personal data, which is the world that Mydata is particularly concerned with open data, which is the main work of the Open Knowledge Foundation. The thing is, I think open data is now widely understood. It's seen as a political benefit. People have made progress with it. That's great. I think personal data has not been solved, but it's a far bigger opportunity. There's a bit in the middle which is a little bit risky. In Britain, they've said, we've got a great idea. We're going to take everyone's health records, we'll just remove the identifier, and then we will then sell them, to insurance companies, and we'll make some money for the government. And people will benefit from faster development of new medicines. Well, I'm sure the computer scientists here amongst us can say that sort of anonymization is totally ineffective in an era where we have an increasing number of total population data sets. If there's anything unique about you, you will be re-identified. So there's a political fallacy that anonymized data belongs in the era of open data and should be treated as such. The reality is, anonymized data is personal data. And certainly the UK Information Commissioner says it's personal data once it's re-identified, but I believe the European view, if we had a proper implementation of the Data Protection Directive, the European view would be, if it can be re-identified, it is personal data and should be treated as such. And this is why I'm really pleased that Open Knowledge Foundation has decided to look at personal data and Mydata, because they are inextricably linked in all sorts of ways, and this is one of them. So, this should say Mydata in Finland, what next? But somehow an old slide has got here. I think it's still do, yeah. I think where we are now in Finland is government is engaging with civil society to ask about what is a wise way to go forward with this. I think it's a very, very good start. I think that what this needs is a mixture of creativity, the creativity you get from entrepreneurial developers, and caution, vigilance, because there are clearly risks. There are risks to businesses who fear the loss of customers through competitive hemorrhaging. There are risks to privacy if Mydata is implemented in a thoughtless way. For example, in the early stages in Britain, people talked about the individual saying it's okay for your personal data to be released from one company to any other company that is acting as an intermediary, which is all the problems of terms and conditions, of unscrupulous intermediaries offering a game of Candy Crush to get hold of all your personal data. So you need a degree of vigilance to ensure that there's a safe infrastructure to get this done. I think a good starting point is to establish the desirability of personal control of personal data. And I think this sits very deeply in a European Enlightenment attitude, if I can put it like that. I think it's very easy to appeal to an individual in a sense. And I think if you work for a company and you realize this is how your customers feel, then you can quite quickly come to a conclusion that it's probably a smart thing for your company to accept that personal control of personal data has a lot of value, a lot of benefit. And in reality, that is a win-win all round. It's a win-win for the individual, for organizations that currently hold personal data, and for a society which wants new entrepreneurs and new trusted digital services. I think it's good to include in your thinking something like Mydex in Finland, because it's helpful to think of that sort of infrastructure as part of the solution. Look, if anyone in the audience wants to sell Mydex connections in Finland, you're more than welcome. We don't do that, we'd be delighted. In reality, the service is there online. If anyone wants to use it or experiment with it, this is available free of charge. We have an API and a sandbox. We can add any data fields you need for the scheme of particular applications. So I'm very happy to have that conversation. I think the aim should be, based on a good dialogue between civil society, business, and government, to go forward and present realistic Mydata principles. I know OKF has a European forum in Berlin in July, and I know that the main players will be there. I should certainly be there. And I understand the Finnish government's looking forward to coming forward with some sort of policy outline in September. So I look forward to seeing that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, William.
Do you have questions now?
Yeah, there's plenty of questions there. Rather challenging one, I would say also. But I'll start from some relatively light ones. So, how about first, you talked about the desirability, and there's a lot of talk about the quantified self movement in Finland. And have you had any collaboration with the quantified self? Are people in the quantified self movement using Mydex, or do you see Mydata community somehow crossing with quantified self in the UK?
Okay, so first of all, I'll just say where Mydex has got to in the market. We have 7 contracts, one of which is potentially very substantial, ID assurance at population scale, but those contracts have not yet implemented connections, so we do not have large numbers of users using Mydex. Mydex is a general data store, so we're equally happy to store data from a Fitbit or a Nike band or any quantified self data, if that's what the individual wants to do. From our point of view, we would view click screen, transaction history, any sort of data the individual wants to use is valid for the individual. So we're not hung up about whether or not quantified self-data is Mydata, because I use the words Mydata to describe the policy for getting governments and business to release the personal data that they hold. But I think if you think of the example of, should I be swimming in the Baltic this summer, or should I run a marathon? This probably depends on your health record to some extent, on information from your Fitbit or quantified self information about the state of your health, and perhaps also on your diet or performance in previous marathons. So it's a classic case where you want holistic data from different aspects of the individual's life in order to answer the question. So we see it as absolutely part of the personal data ecosystem. Whether or not it's part of a Mydata policy is not a principal concern.
Then sort of related to this, there's quite a couple of questions about can you give us a really concrete example on how people are using the Mydex service at the moment?
Yeah, well, I can say what is contracted because organisations have placed contracts to do it. So for example, a housing association wants to do tenant registration and manage the relationship with housing tenants using Mydex. There are 3 local authorities contracted with Mydex for adult social care, which is linked up with health in many ways. And then the central government has contracted with Mydex for ID assurance, where they wish to receive certain proofs or verifications about an individual before giving them a digital service. And there are 5 suppliers for this, 4 of them very large, well-known global brands, and Mydex is the 5th. So in the case of Mydex, they're accepting that these proofs can come from the individual. But these services are in alpha or beta trial now, and they're being rolled out in months to come. So that's the stage which we're at. I should say, any question in English I'll find fine. Any question in Finnish I'll find really challenging.
Okay. There is, I think this is an interesting one. There's questions about the authentication and how. So you have the authentications sort of linked to the service and the Mydex ID, but in Finland we have, for example, the state-provided ID. In general, there is in many Finnish services are using the bank authentication, and how do you see like this decoupling sort of Mydata sort of management side of the service and then authentication?
Yeah, I think in Britain we're starting from a very different place from Finland. You've been using bank authentication for 10 years, haven't you? And I think Niels rightly said that in Finland you have a very high level of trust in government. I was in Tampere at a public services conference 4 years ago. The day it was announced by the EU that Finland once again had the highest level of trust from its citizens of any country in Europe. And the first thing the minister said when she stood up was, "We must work harder to earn the trust of our citizens." That's my girl. In Britain we're very suspicious of our government, and with very good reasons. And they proposed an identity scheme with national identity cards and a central audit register. And the language of this is, in order to offer any service to anyone, we must know exactly that they are who they say they are. And we want a gold standard of identity, which we think presents a very high level of risk, because it can be compromised. If it's compromised, it's a complete disaster. So the Mydex authentication model, as I say, you can start with an email address. But what happens is you accumulate proof of the relationships that you have. So it's more like a graduated risk model. And if you don't need a very high level of proof for a particular transaction, you can do that very easily. If you're doing a transaction where you need a very, very high level of proof, you can provide a lot of proof conveniently if you've accumulated that from your transactions, and you can go further. This could be from relationships with banks, local authorities, government agencies, phone companies. It could be evidence of your own relationships on social networks. I mean, we simply offer a generic platform for acquiring the proofs and redeploying them. What level of proof is needed is a market matter. Really, the market should decide how efficient it wants transactions to be and what level of risk it's happy to accept. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you. So then, sort of related question about sort of service interoperability, or sort of how can you create multiple copies of same data that you store in the Mydex service, and how, you talked about how to create trust, and one really source for trust is that you are not dependent on your service.
I think there's a lot of people who have shared the vision of a person-centric data ecosystem, but you can divide them into the ones who want to rule the world because they want to be the ones to provide the personal data ecosystem, and the ones like Mydex who feel that diversity and interoperability between these services is absolutely essential. You have to be able to leave one service and take your data back and to put it into a different service, or to use different services for different aspects of your life. That's essential. So our work towards interoperability comes out, I think there's a, I've just put up here, there's a few logos of organizations that we subscribe to see their emerging credibility. One of them is Open Identity Exchange, OIX. This is the merger of the Identity Cards Foundation with the Open ID group in the States. And they are leading the UK government contracts on interoperability between ID services. We belong to, this is the Personal Data Ecosystem Consortium, which is a group of entrepreneurs and visionaries who sign up to the general principles of a diverse, interoperable personal data ecosystem. So to us, it's self-evident that this is very important. Exactly how it happens, we're pragmatic. I mean, it might be that it needs another Finnish solution, like with SMS and GSM, as I think Ossi suggested. You know, there's an opportunity to present a degree of standardization early in the process. We're flexible and adaptable like that.
There's one very concrete question just emerged about the costs.
Mm-hmm.
So, how much will it cost for smaller service providers to integrate Mydata with their services? Are there any ready-made API integration kits?
Okay, so there are ready-made. The API is standard and ready in there. You can connect to the API and you can develop a service in the sandbox entirely for free. If you want to connect a live service, then there's a charge for connection and a charge per individual. And then in the second and third years, there's a 25% service charge. So imagine you're connecting a service for, say, 20,000 people. In the first year, you would pay £10,000 to connect the service, plus £1,500 for that number of individuals. And in the subsequent year, you pay a 25% service fee to maintain that connection. And when it stops, it stops. So at scale, for large numbers of people, this is how we get to the figure of 10 years of connection for the price of one letter, 40 pence. But if anyone wants to get that in writing afterwards, I'll happily share. But I think all the experimentation you do for Mydata, so for example, we did Mydata hackathons in Britain, which had interesting lessons, incidentally. None of the applications developed were about switching accounts. They were all about the integrated life of the individual. All that work is free of charge because it's experimental.
I think that we need to go to the audience live questions. I have just one here that I would like to you somehow address. So you talked about this voluntary sort of generation of data, so that individuals that would be really huge. That instead of having sort of implicit data profiles that are generated at the moment by Google and so on, it would be much more richer, much more better for businesses if I actually would provide voluntary data. And I think that this is great. But how do you make the first step? Like, have you seen something like this happening already? The current Mydata beta alpha users that they actually start generating their own profiles that are not the information that is.
We haven't seen, but I think we will see this year what Doc Searles, who's the author of The Intention Economy, he's very strong on a personally controlled marketing environment. He has something called Project VRM at Harvard University, back vendor relationship management, the opposite of CRM. He talks of a personal RFP. So that's where the individual can say, in an encrypted and protected format, I'm interested in this journey, or I'm interested in purchasing a hybrid SUV, or whatever it is, and that individual is discoverable. We will see, I think, the first personal RFPs this year. There's a couple of, which one it'll be, I don't quite know, but I think we'll see that this year. So it's at a very early stage.
Great. Then, Jan.
Yes.
You have microphone.
Okay.
But I think
that's
good.
fine.
First of all, I'd like to say I like this term data give back. It's very appealing for the first step on the Mydata journey. But the actual question is that do you intend to take care of all the data sets? You might have several different areas, so it might just be that we need one central hub for control, and then you would perhaps have an ecosystem of these data operators around you.
So the way we approach this is to say, we have a data schema which is published. You can see it at the resource dev.mydex.org. If you wish to connect a record or to develop a service which requires additional data sets, we will add that free of charge. And where these appear to replicate, so for example your name and address field is replicated over and over again perhaps, then you have a master field, and when you update that, you have the option to update every other version of that field. So we think it'll be a very large data schema, but that's not a problem.
Any other live questions or directly from the audience? Okay, no, in that case, there's plenty of questions still in the web stream. So Yoki and others will help you to check them through, and then I hope you can respond to them in the internet chat. But at this point, I thank you, and perhaps I will give the last words to Ossi.
Yeah, you get very good insight to the Mydata, but I think we need a little break.
Should we upload?
Okay, first, yeah, thanks for